Did you know that before 1941, most women in the American workforce were young and single? They worked as teachers, secretaries, or clerks. Heavy industry, the world of machines and metal, was a man's world. Completely. Then, everything changed. By 1944, more than 6 million women had joined the workforce, many for the first time. They weren't typing letters, they were building the machines of war. They were welding ship hulls in the freezing rain. They were wiring the complex electrical systems of bombers. They were riveting wings together, thousands of rivets per plane, their hands aching. We see the photos, a young woman in a bandana, her face smudged with grease, confidently operating a lathe. A team of women laughing as they work on the nose cone of a massive plane. These images are powerful, but they also raise questions. Who were these women really? Did they go from baking pies to building bombers overnight? Was it as glamorous as the posters made it seem? And the biggest question of all, when the fighting stopped, what happened to them? Number 15. What did it take to turn a housewife into a shipbuilder? It didn't happen with a magic wand. It happened with desperation and a massive nationwide effort. Before the war, a woman's place was in the home. That wasn't just an opinion, it was a deep-seated cultural belief. Industry leaders were skeptical. Could women, who they saw as delicate and unskilled in mechanical things, handle this kind of work? Could they lift heavy parts? Could they endure the noise, the grime, the danger of a factory floor? They didn't have a choice. The men were leaving for the military by the millions. The factories had orders to fill. The country's survival depended on it. So the great experiment began. Companies had to completely rethink their training programs. They couldn't afford years-long apprenticeships. They needed skilled workers in weeks, not years. They broke down complex tasks into smaller, manageable steps. A person didn't need to learn how to build an entire engine. They needed to learn how to do one specific task perfectly over and over again. This was the genius of the assembly line applied to a new workforce. Companies like Boeing, Douglas Aircraft, and Ford developed their own training schools. Women would walk in, some having never held a tool heavier than a hammer, and walk out a few weeks later as riveters, welders, or electricians. The training was intense and practical. They learned blueprint reading, a language of lines and numbers that was completely foreign to most. They learned how to use micrometers and calipers, tools of fine precision. They practiced on scrap metal before they were ever allowed to touch a real airplane wing. The government helped too. The National Youth Administration and the Office of Education funded vocational training programs across the country. A 1943 report by the U.S. Office of Education detailed how these programs were rapidly converting unskilled women into proficient industrial workers. They found that women often excelled in tasks requiring patience and manual dexterity. They were good at detail work like wiring instrument panels, a job so complex it was called a spaghetti bowl of wires. The companies also had to adapt the factories themselves. They brought in engineers to design new, lighter tools, a rivet gun that a large man could handle all day was too heavy for many women. So they developed smaller, more ergonomic versions. They designed special safety equipment like hairnets and modified goggles to accommodate women. They had to build new restrooms. It sounds simple, but on a factory floor that was a mile long and designed only for men, it was a major logistical challenge. The photos show women standing on crates to reach their workstations. They show them using specially designed jigs and hoists to lift heavy materials. The environment was being remade around them because it had to be. It was a process of rapid, on-the-fly innovation driven by necessity. But what did we not see in the training manuals or the company reports? How many women were turned away because they weren't deemed trainable? What were the quiet conversations between women on the training floor, sharing fears and tips that the male instructors never heard? And how many accidents, small and large, happened during this frantic training period, accidents that were never officially recorded? Number 14, who was the real Rosie? We all know the image, the woman in the blue work shirt, her hair tied up in a red and white polka dot bandana. She flexes her bicep. The caption above her reads, "We can do it." That's Rosie the Riveter. But she wasn't real. And funnily enough, that specific poster created by an artist named J. Howard Miller for the Westinghouse Electric Corporation, was barely seen during the war. It was displayed internally at Westinghouse factories for a couple of weeks in 1943, and then it disappeared. It only became famous decades later. The Rosie that people actually knew during the war looked very different. She was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post on May 29th, 1943, painted by the famous artist Norman Rockwell. This Rosie was a muscular woman in overalls eating a sandwich during her lunch break. She has a rivet gun resting on her lap. Her foot is propped up on a copy of a book by a German political leader. She was a symbol of strength and defiance. Rockwell's model was a 19-year-old telephone operator from Vermont named Mary Doyle Keefe. She was petite, not brawny, and Rockwell later apologized for making her look so large. But Rosie wasn't just one person or one painting. She was a composite, an idea that represented millions of real women. There were, however, a few women who were identified as the inspiration for the name. One was Rosalind P. Walter, a woman from a wealthy Long Island family who worked the night shift driving rivets into the Corsair fighter plane. Popular song, Rosie the Riveter, written by Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb, was supposedly inspired by her. The song was a hit, and it helped cement the name Rosie in the public consciousness. Another contender was Rose Will Monroe. She was a Kentucky native who moved to Michigan to work at the Ford Willow Run bomber plant. She was a riveter on the B-24 and B-29 bombers. A Hollywood actor, Walter Pidgeon, was touring the plant for a promotional film when he discovered her. She fit the part perfectly. She was a real riveter, and her name was actually Rose. She starred in a film that was shown in movie theaters to encourage women to go to work. So in a way, she became the living embodiment of the song. The truth is, there was no single Rosie. The name became a catch-all term for every woman who worked in the factories. The woman inspecting bombshells, the woman wiring a control panel, the woman welding a ship's keel. They were all Rosies. The icon was a piece of propaganda, a useful tool to recruit women. The reality was a diverse army of 6 million individuals, each with her own story, her own reasons for being there, and her own struggles. The simple, powerful image hid a much more complex reality. So why did the We Can Do It poster, which was obscured during the war, become the defining image of this era 40 years later? How many women who actually worked these jobs ever identified with that specific image? And what happened to the stories of the millions of women who weren't named Rose, who didn't get discovered by Hollywood, and whose faces never appeared on a magazine cover? Number 13, what did they actually build? They built everything, but their most visible contributions were in the sky and on the sea. The photos of women climbing over the skeletons of massive airplanes are some of the most iconic. They weren't just tightening a few bolts, they were responsible for entire sections of the most advanced aircraft of the day. At the Douglas Aircraft Company in California, women made up nearly half the workforce by 1944. They built the C-47 Skytrain transport plane and the A-20 Havoc attack bomber. The photos show teams of women, known as riveting teams, working together. One woman would handle the heavy riveting gun on the outside of the fuselage, while another, often smaller woman called a bucker, would crawl inside the tight wing or tail section to hold a bucking bar against the rivet. It was noisy, physically demanding work. A single bomber, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, contained over 350,000 rivets, and women put most of them in. The most famous aircraft factory was Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan. It was a modern marvel, a mile-long assembly line designed to churn out B-24 Liberator bombers at an astonishing rate. At its peak, a new B-24 rolled off the line every 63 minutes. A huge portion of the 42,000 workers at Willow Run were women. They came from all over the country, drawn by the high wages. They assembled engines, installed hydraulic systems, and fitted the plexiglass nose cones. And they were a critical part of what was called the arsenal of democracy. The work on ships was just as crucial, and perhaps even more grueling. The shipyards operated 24 hours a day in all weather. Women worked as welders, a job that had been almost exclusively male. They wore heavy leather protective gear and helmets, their faces illuminated by the bright flash of the welding arc. They pieced together the massive steel plates that formed the hulls of Liberty ships. These were cargo ships built quickly and in huge numbers. They were not pretty, but they were vital for carrying supplies across the oceans. The shipyards of Henry J. Kaiser in California and Oregon were pioneers in prefabrication. They would build huge sections of a ship in a workshop and then use giant cranes to lift them into place. This assembly line approach dramatically cut down construction time. By 1943, Kaiser's yards were launching a new ship, on average, every 10 hours. The women were a key part of this production miracle. They worked as welders, electricians, pipe fitters, and even operated the massive cranes. They built the machines that made the difference. Every plane they finished, every ship they launched, was a tangible contribution. The numbers are staggering. American industry produced over 300,000 aircraft and 141 aircraft carriers during the war. It's impossible to know the exact percentage, but a huge amount of that work was done by women's hands. They weren't just supporting the war effort from home. They were on the front lines of production. But how did the quality of their work compare to that of the men they replaced? Were there whispered concerns among engineers and military officials about female-built planes and ships? And what did a woman feel seeing a massive bomber she had helped build take off for the first time, knowing where it was going and the risks involved? Number 12, how did they deal with the danger? The factory floor was not a safe place. The photographs often show smiling women, clean and posed. The reality was different. It was a world of constant noise, dangerous machinery, and toxic materials. The noise was the first thing you noticed. The ceaseless roar of engines, the high-pitched whine of drills, and the deafening clatter of rivet guns. Many women reported temporary or even permanent hearing loss. It was a sound that you didn't just hear with your ears, you felt it in your bones all day long. Then there was the machinery itself. These were powerful industrial machines with rapidly moving parts. A moment of distraction, a loose piece of clothing, or a stray strand of hair could lead to a horrific accident. Safety regulations were not what they are today. Women were trained on safety, of course. They were told to wear their hair up in bandanas or snoods, a practical measure that became a fashion statement. But accidents happened, people lost fingers, hands, and sometimes their lives. A 1945 report from the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor highlighted the specific risks women faced, noting that their accident rates were sometimes higher than men's in the beginning as they were unaccustomed to the industrial environment. The materials they worked with were also hazardous. Welders had to be careful of welder's flash, a painful burn to the eyes caused by the bright arc. They worked with asbestos for insulation, not knowing its long-term health effects. Women who painted airplane parts, a job called doping, worked with toxic chemicals that could cause severe skin irritation and respiratory problems. The paint used for glowing instrument dials was radioactive. The radium girls of the First World War had already shown the deadly effects of this, but the risks were not fully understood or communicated to the new workforce. The physical strain was immense. Many jobs required standing for 10 or 12 hours at a stretch. Others involved lifting heavy parts, crawling into cramped spaces, or holding a vibrating tool all day. The work was repetitive and exhausting. The women developed calluses on their hands, their backs ached, their feet swelled. This was hard physical labor, far removed from any pre-war ideas of women's work. Despite the dangers they carried on, they developed a sense of camaraderie, looking out for one another on the factory floor. They took pride in their ability to handle the tough environment. They were not just proving to the country that they could do the job, they were proving it to themselves. The grease under their fingernails and the soreness in their muscles were badges of honor. They were tough, and they knew it. What was the real number of workplace injuries and fatalities among women during the war, a number that might have been downplayed to maintain morale? How many women suffered from long-term health problems years later, from exposure to chemicals like asbestos and lead? And did the women ever talk openly about their fear, or was it an unspoken rule that you had to act tough to survive in that world? Number 11. Was it just about patriotism? Patriotism was a huge part of it. You can't deny that. The posters, the newsreels, the songs, they all hammered home the same message: your country needs you. Working in a defense plant was framed as a patriotic duty, a way for women to directly contribute to the war effort while their husbands, brothers, and sons were overseas. For many women, this was a powerful motivator. They felt a deep sense of purpose. They were part of something bigger than themselves. Every rivet they drove was a blow against the enemy. The government's propaganda machine, run by the Office of War Information (OWI), was incredibly effective. They created the Rosie the Riveter icon and many others like it. They produced films and radio programs celebrating the female factory worker. This campaign didn't just aim to recruit women, it aimed to make industrial work acceptable, even glamorous, for them. It worked to overcome the resistance of husbands and fathers who were reluctant to let their wives and daughters enter such a masculine environment. But it wasn't the only reason. For millions of women, the decision to work was also deeply personal and economic. The pay was a huge draw. A woman working in a defense plant could earn far more than she ever could in a traditional female job like a waitress or a shop girl. The average weekly wage in an aircraft factory in 1943 was around $54. A female department store clerk might make less than half that. This was life-changing money. For the first time, many women had their own income, their own economic independence. They could support their families, save for the future, or just buy things they'd never been able to afford before. For some, it was a matter of survival. If their husband was in the military, his pay might not be enough to support the family back home. The factory job was a necessity. For others, it was a chance for adventure and escape. Young women from small towns and rural areas flocked to the industrial centers of California, Michigan, and the Pacific Northwest. It was a chance to see the world, to meet new people, and to break free from the constraints of their old lives. The historian Emily Yellen, in her book Our Mother's War, collected numerous oral histories from these women. Their stories are filled with a mix of motivations, duty, money, excitement, and a desire for personal freedom. And for some, it was about proving something. They wanted to show that they could do the work, that they were just as capable as men. There was a sense of pride in mastering a difficult skill, in contributing to a complex machine. They were challenging stereotypes and expanding their own sense of what was possible. The patriotism was real, but it was interwoven with these other more personal motivations. It was a complex decision driven by a unique mix of national duty and individual need. So, how many women privately admitted they were more motivated by the paycheck than by patriotism? Did the constant government propaganda create a pressure to conform, making it difficult for women to quit even if they were miserable? And was there a class divide where women from poorer backgrounds were driven by necessity, while women from wealthier families were more likely to be driven by a sense of patriotic duty? Number 10, were they all white and young? The classic image of Rosie the Riveter is of a young white woman. The models on the posters, the women featured in magazine articles, they almost all fit this description. But this picture is incomplete. The female workforce was far more diverse than the propaganda ever showed. Women of all ages, races, and backgrounds rolled up their sleeves and went to work. Older women, many in their 40s and 50s, joined the workforce in large numbers. These were often women whose children were grown. They saw the war as their chance to re-enter the world of work or to contribute in a new way. They brought maturity and stability to the factory floor. They were often seen as mother figures by the younger girls, offering advice and a steadying presence. Their contributions were vital, but they are often overlooked in the popular memory of the era. The most significant untold story is that of African American women. For them, the war was a double victory campaign. They were fighting for victory abroad and for victory over discrimination at home. Before the war, job opportunities for black women were severely limited, mostly confined to domestic service or farm labor. The defense boom offered a chance for better pay and skilled work, but they had to fight for it. Many employers, especially in the beginning, simply refused to hire black women. They faced a wall of prejudice. It took pressure from civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph, who threatened a massive march on Washington to force a change. In June 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which banned racial discrimination in the defense industry and created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPEC, to enforce it. This was a landmark decision, but it didn't end discrimination overnight. Many companies complied only grudgingly. African American women were often the last to be hired and the first to be fired. They were frequently given the hardest, dirtiest, and most dangerous jobs. They faced hostility, not just from management, but from some of their white coworkers as well. Despite these obstacles, hundreds of thousands of black women entered the industrial workforce. They became welders in the shipyards of Alabama, riveters in the aircraft plants of California, and munitions workers in the factories of the Midwest. The photos exist, though they are less common. They show black women at drill presses, inspecting shells, and working on assembly lines. Their story is one of incredible resilience and determination. They seized an opportunity born of crisis to challenge the economic and social barriers that had held them back. The research of historians like Maureen Honey, in her book Creating Rosie the Riveter, Class, Gender, and Propaganda During World War II, has been crucial in bringing these hidden histories to light. So, why was the image of the white Rosie so heavily promoted while the contributions of women of color were largely ignored by the mainstream media? How did the experience of working in an integrated, or at least semi-integrated, factory change the racial attitudes of the women who worked there? And what happened to the specific stories of struggle and triumph of the hundreds of thousands of minority women who were a crucial part of this workforce? Number 9, what happened after the whistle blew? The work didn't end when the factory whistle blew for the end of a shift. For millions of women, especially those with children, it was the start of the second shift. After 10 or 12 hours of grueling physical labor, they went home to face all the domestic responsibilities they had before the war. They had to shop for groceries, often in stores with long lines and rationed goods. They had to cook meals, clean the house, do laundry, and care for their children. It was utterly exhausting. Childcare was one of the biggest challenges, with fathers away and mothers at work. Who would look after the children? Some women were lucky enough to have grandparents or other relatives nearby. Many were not. They were forced to cobble together solutions. They might leave their children with a neighbor or pay an older woman in the community to watch them. In the worst cases, older siblings were left in charge of younger ones, or children were left alone, becoming latchkey kids long before the term was common. The media was full of worried stories about rising juvenile delinquency, and the blame was often placed on working mothers. The government recognized the problem, albeit slowly. In 1943, Congress passed the Lanham Act, which provided federal funds for communities to establish childcare centers. These centers were a lifesaver for many women. They provided a safe place for their children to stay during the day, with trained staff and hot meals. The most famous of these were the child care centers set up by the industrialist Henry Kaiser at his shipyards in Oregon. They were open 24 hours a day to accommodate all 3 shifts. They even offered a service where mothers could drop off a shopping list in the morning and pick up their groceries and a cooked meal to take home after work. But the Kaiser centers were the exception, not the rule. The Lanham Act centers were never widespread enough to meet the demand. By the end of the war, they were only serving a fraction of the children who needed care. Many communities resisted opening them, arguing that a woman's place was at home with her children, not in a factory. And many women hesitated to use them, either because of the social stigma or because they were located too far from their homes or workplaces. Life outside the factory was a constant juggle. Women lived in crowded boarding houses or hastily built government housing projects near the factories. These war boom towns often lacked basic services like schools, hospitals, and grocery stores. But this period also saw the creation of new communities. Women who worked together also lived together. They formed deep friendships, relying on each other for support, childcare, and companionship. They created a new kind of family born of shared experience and mutual need. How many women were forced to quit their jobs, not because they couldn't do the work, but because they simply couldn't find reliable childcare? What was the real psychological toll of working the second shift on these women's health and well-being? And did the widespread government-funded childcare of the Lanham Act plant a seed for future social programs, or was it seen as a purely temporary emergency measure to be dismantled as quickly as possible? And number 8, how much did they get paid? The money was good. There's no question about that. For a woman who had been working as a seamstress for 25 cents an hour, the starting wage of 60 cents an hour at an aircraft plant felt like a fortune. But good is not the same as equal. From the very beginning of the war, there was a significant pay gap between men and women, even when they were doing the exact same job. The principle of equal pay for equal work was not widely accepted. Employers argued that women required more supervision, that they weren't the primary breadwinners, or that they were only temporary workers, so they didn't deserve the same pay as men. The government and the unions made some efforts to address this. The National War Labor Board, NULB, established in 1942, issued several rulings that supported the idea of equal pay. In a landmark case involving General Motors, the NWLB, stated that wages should be paid to the female employees on the principle of equal pay for equal work. This was a huge step forward, at least on paper. Some unions, like the United Auto Workers UAW and the United Electrical Workers UE, also officially supported equal pay. But the reality on the factory floor was often different. Companies found ways to get around the rules. A common tactic was to change the job classifications. A job that had been done by a man might be relabeled as a light or female version of the same job, and a lower pay scale would be attached to it. Or women would be kept in the lower paying entry-level positions, while men were promoted more quickly to higher paying roles. So even if the official policy was equal pay, the system was often rigged to ensure that women earned less. On average, women in manufacturing earned about 65% of what men earned. The numbers varied by industry, but the gap was always there. Despite this, the wages were still a powerful lure. This new income gave women a level of economic freedom they had never known. They could pay off debts, buy homes, and save money. They opened their own bank accounts for the first time. Historian Alice Kessler Harris, in her book Out to Work, argues that this economic independence had a profound and lasting impact on women's sense of self-worth and their role within the family. This new economic power was visible. Women bought cars. They bought new clothes, even with rationing. They went to movies and dances. They were able to support their children without having to rely on a male breadwinner. This newfound financial autonomy was transformative. It changed not only how they saw themselves, but also how they were seen by society. They were no longer just dependents, they were economic actors in their own right. The paycheck was more than just money, it was a symbol of independence and capability. How many official complaints about unequal pay were filed with the NWB or unions? And how many of them were actually resolved in favor of the women? Did the experience of earning a substantial independent income change how women managed their household finances and made family decisions even after the war? And was there resentment among the men who were left behind in civilian jobs, who saw women taking on their roles even if at a lower wage? Number 7, did the men want them there? The reception was mixed. Officially, the message was one of welcome and partnership. Newspapers and magazines ran stories about how well women were adapting to factory life and how the male workers were gallantly helping them learn the ropes. Some of this was true. Many men recognized the necessity of the situation. Their jobs and the country's fate depended on keeping the production lines moving. They saw the women as co-workers in a shared national cause. Many were patient teachers sharing their skills and knowledge with the new female recruits. But there was also significant resistance and hostility. For generations, the factory floor had been an exclusively male domain. It was a place of rough language, physical strength, and a specific kind of masculine culture. The arrival of millions of women was a shock to this system. Some men felt that women didn't belong there, that they were taking men's jobs even if those men were off at war, and that they would drive down wages. They complained that women were too emotional, that they couldn't handle the pressure, and that they were a distraction. Sexual harassment was a serious problem. While the term didn't exist in its modern form, the behavior certainly did. Women reported constant catcalls, unwanted touching, and pressure for dates from male co-workers and foremen. In the hypermasculine culture of the shipyards and factories, women were often seen as fair game. A 1943 study by the Social Science Research Council on war plant workers found that sex-based joking and horseplay were rampant, and that women had to develop a thick skin to survive. They had little recourse. Complaining could get you labeled as a troublemaker or even get you fired. Most women simply learned to ignore it or to dish it back, adopting a tough exterior as a form of self-protection. The unions were also divided. While the national leadership of some unions, like the UAW, officially supported women workers, the attitudes in the local union halls were often much more conservative. Many male union members saw women as a threat to their job security and their bargaining power. They worried that after the war, companies would want to keep the cheaper female labor, pushing men out of their jobs. They fought to maintain separate seniority lists for men and women, ensuring that women would be the first to be laid off when the war ended. Despite the challenges, many women earned the respect of their male colleagues. They proved through their hard work, their skill, and their endurance that they could do the job just as well. They learned the lingo, they could take a joke, and they didn't complain. They became part of the team. The shared experience of working long hours toward a common goal forged bonds that crossed gender lines. They might not have been welcomed with open arms by everyone, but by the end of the war, they had carved out a place for themselves on the factory floor. How many women left their jobs, not because of the difficulty of the work, but because of harassment from male colleagues or supervisors? Did the unions that officially supported women actually go to bat for them in cases of discrimination or harassment at the local level? And how did the dynamic change in factories where the workforce became majority female? Did the culture of the workplace shift to reflect that? Number 6, what did they think of the propaganda? The propaganda was everywhere. It was on posters in the post office, in articles in Life magazine, in movies, and on the radio. And it presented a very specific image of the woman war worker. She was young, attractive, and always smiling. Her overalls were clean, her hair was perfectly coiffed under her bandana, and she handled her tools with a kind of effortless grace. She was doing her part for the war, but she never lost her femininity. The message was clear: you can be a riveter, but you're still a lady. This was a carefully constructed image designed to be as non-threatening as possible to traditional ideas about gender. How did the real women feel about this? For many, it was a source of amusement. They would look at the glamorous pictures of Rosies in the magazines and laugh. Their own reality was so different. They were covered in grease, not makeup. Their muscles ached. Their hands were rough with calluses. The work was hard and dirty, not glamorous. They knew the posters were a fantasy, a recruitment tool. In oral histories, like those collected by Schöneberger Gluck in Rosie the Riveter Revisited, women often recall the disconnect between the media image and their lived experience. At the same time, the propaganda did have a powerful effect. It gave them a sense of identity and importance. The figure of Rosie the Riveter gave them a name and a face. It acknowledged their contribution and celebrated their strength. Even if the details were wrong, the underlying message that their work was vital to the nation was something they took to heart. And it helped build morale and created a sense of solidarity among the women workers. They might not have looked like the women in the posters, but they felt like Rosies. The propaganda also served a more subtle purpose. By constantly emphasizing the femininity of the workers, it reassured the public and the women themselves that this was a temporary situation. The message was that women could do a man's job, but they hadn't become men. They were still wives, mothers, and daughters who would happily return to their proper roles once the emergency was over. This was a crucial part of selling the idea to a skeptical public. The articles in women's magazines from the period are a fascinating mix of empowerment and containment. They would have a feature on how to be a great welder, right next to an article on how to pack a lunchbox that your husband would love. So while the women might have rolled their eyes at the more idealized depictions of themselves, they also understood the power of the image. It was a double-edged sword. It celebrated them, but it also constrained them. It gave them a new identity, but one that was always framed as temporary. They were heroes for the duration, but the propaganda always hinted that their heroism had an expiration date. Did any women actively resist or publicly criticize the overly feminized and unrealistic propaganda images of themselves? How did the propaganda images differ for women of color, if they were depicted at all? And did the constant emphasis on the temporary nature of their work create a sense of anxiety among the women who had come to depend on their jobs and their new independence? Number 5, how did the work change them? The experience of working in the defense industries changed the women who did it in profound and lasting ways. For many, it was the first time they had ever worked outside the home, the first time they had earned their own money, and the first time they had been part of such a large and diverse enterprise. This experience reshaped their view of themselves and their place in the world. The most immediate change was a newfound sense of confidence and competence. They discovered that they could do things they never thought possible. They learned to read blueprints, to operate complex machinery, to work as part of a team. They mastered skills that had always been considered male. This was incredibly empowering. It broke down the psychological barriers that had told them their whole lives that they were not suited for mechanical work. They proved to themselves and to the world that they were capable. This confidence extended beyond the factory floor. It changed how they carried themselves, how they spoke, and how they thought about their own potential. Their social worlds also expanded dramatically. Women from different backgrounds, different parts of the country, and different racial and ethnic groups were suddenly working side by side. A young woman from a farm in Oklahoma might find herself working with a former teacher from Chicago and an immigrant from Italy. This was especially true for women who moved to the booming war towns. They were removed from their old social networks and forced to create new ones. This exposure to different people and different ways of life broadened their perspectives. It broke down prejudices and fostered a sense of shared identity based on their work. The economic independence they gained was perhaps the most transformative change of all. Having their own paycheck gave them a new level of autonomy. They could make their own financial decisions. They didn't have to ask a husband or father for money. This shifted the power dynamics within their families. It gave them a greater say in household decisions. For single women, it meant they could support themselves and live independently. This taste of economic freedom was something that many were reluctant to give up. The work also changed them physically. They became stronger. Their bodies, accustomed to domestic tasks, adapted to the rigors of industrial labor. But it also took a toll. The long hours, the physical strain, and the exposure to hazardous materials left their mark. They were constantly tired. But even the physical exhaustion was part of a larger transformation. They were no longer the delicate flowers of pre-war ideology. They were strong, capable women who could hold their own in a tough environment. The war effort forged a new kind of woman, one who was more confident, more independent, and more aware of her own capabilities than ever before. What did these women do with their new skills and confidence in the decades after the war? How did their wartime work experience influence how they raised their own daughters? And was there a hidden psychological cost? Did the sudden thrust into a high-pressure, masculine world leave some women with unseen scars? Number 4, what happened when the men came home? When the war ended in 1945, there was a massive collective sigh of relief. But for the millions of women working in the defense plants, the celebration was mixed with anxiety. They knew what was coming. The same propaganda machine that had lured them into the factories with images of patriotic Rosies now shifted into reverse. The new message, promoted by the government, the media, and even some unions, was clear: your job is done. It's time to go home and make way for the returning veterans. The layoffs began almost immediately. Within a month of the war's end, hundreds of thousands of women had lost their jobs. The factories that had been running 24/7 scaled back production or shut down completely. The seniority systems that had been put in place, often with separate lists for men and women, ensured that women were the first to go. A study by the United Auto Workers found that by the end of 1945, women's share of jobs in the auto industry had plummeted from 25% to just 7.5%. The pattern was the same across the country. The social pressure was intense. Magazine articles celebrated the joys of homemaking. Ads depicted happy families reunited, with the woman firmly back in the kitchen. Women who wanted to keep working were often portrayed as selfish or unpatriotic, as if they were stealing jobs from the heroic men who had fought for their country. The message was that their real job was to be wives and mothers, to create a comfortable home for the returning soldiers, and to help the nation return to a sense of normalcy. But a surprising number of women didn't want to go home. A survey conducted by the Women's Bureau in 1945 found that 75% of the women who had been working wanted to keep their jobs. They had gotten used to the income and the independence. They enjoyed the camaraderie of the workplace and the sense of purpose their jobs gave them. For many, going back to being a full-time homemaker felt like a step backward, but they had few options. The high-paying, skilled industrial jobs were gone. The jobs that were available to them were the traditional, low-paying women's jobs in clerical work, sales, and service industries. The end of the war also meant the end of the support systems that had made their work possible. The government-funded Lanham Act child care centers were shut down almost immediately. The public consensus was that they were no longer needed. This put working mothers in an impossible position. Even if they could find a job, who would watch their children? The swift dismantling of the childcare system sent a clear message about the nation's priorities. So the Rosies hung up their overalls and put away their rivet guns. Some did so willingly, happy to return to a more traditional life. But many did. So, with a sense of loss and frustration, they had proven they could do the work, but now they were being told that their contributions were no longer needed or wanted. The factory gates had been opened to them out of desperation, and they were closed just as quickly when the crisis was over. How many women fought to keep their jobs, and what forms did their resistance take? Were there public protests or organized campaigns by women who had been laid off? And what was the emotional impact of this sudden dismissal, of being hailed as a hero one day and told you were no longer needed the next? Number 3, did the world really go back to the way it was? On the surface, it looked like it did. The men came home, the women left the factories, and the country settled into the suburban conformity of the 1950s. The feminine mystique, a term coined by Betty Friedan, took hold. The ideal woman was once again a happy homemaker, her life revolving around her husband, her children, and her new kitchen appliances. It seemed as if the Rosie the Riveter era had been a temporary anomaly, a brief interruption in the traditional order of things. But that's not the whole story. Like, the world didn't go back to the way it was. You know, the seeds of change that had been planted during the war continued to grow, even if they were under the surface. The millions of women who had worked in the factories did not simply forget their experiences. They had learned new skills. They had tasted economic independence. They had gained a new sense of their own capabilities. This knowledge didn't just disappear. Many women who were pushed out of industrial jobs did not leave the workforce entirely. They found other work, often in the growing clerical and service sectors. The percentage of women in the labor force, which had peaked at 36% during the war, dropped immediately after, but it never returned to its pre-war level. And it soon began to climb again. By the 1950s, more women were working than ever before, especially older, married women. The wartime experience had broken a major psychological barrier. It was now more socially acceptable for a married woman to work, even if it was just to earn extra money for the family. More importantly, the women of the war generation passed a different set of expectations on to their daughters. These were the young women who had come of age in the 1960s. They grew up hearing the stories of what their mothers had done during the war. They saw the pictures of their mothers in overalls holding power tools. They grew up with a different model of what a woman could be and do. The historian Ruth Milkman, in her book Gender at Work, argues that the Rosie the Riveter experience, even though it was temporary, created a legacy of consciousness that influenced the next generation's feminist movement. The women who fought for equal pay and equal opportunity in the 1960s and 70s were, in many ways, standing on the shoulders of their mothers. The war also changed the workplace, even if many of the gains were rolled back. The unions had been forced to accept women as members in large numbers. The idea of equal pay for equal work had been introduced into the national conversation, even if it wasn't widely practiced. The experience of the war showed that women could be integrated into all sectors of the economy. The memory of what had been possible during the crisis lingered. It provided a powerful argument for future generations who would fight to reopen the doors that had been closed. The world tried to put the genie back in the bottle, but it was too late. The bottle was broken. So, was the 1950s ideal of the suburban housewife a genuine social consensus? Or was it a carefully constructed myth designed to counteract the disruptive changes of the war years? How many women who became homemakers in the 50s felt a secret sense of frustration or unfulfilled potential, remembering their time in the factories? And can a direct line be drawn from a mother's experience on a B-17 assembly line to her daughter's decision to join a protest march 20 years later? Number 2, were the photos just propaganda? Yes, they were. But that doesn't mean they weren't also true. This is the central paradox of the photographs of women in the war industries. The vast majority of these images were not candid shots taken by photojournalists. They were carefully staged and managed by government agencies like the Office of War Information, OWI, or by the companies themselves. Their purpose was clear: to recruit women into the workforce and to boost morale on the home front. The photographers were given specific instructions. They were told to capture images of women who were attractive, healthy, and happy in their work. The factories were cleaned up for the photo shoots. The women were often posed with their tools, their hair and makeup carefully done. The lighting was dramatic. The goal was to create an image that was both inspiring and reassuring. It needed to show that women were capable of doing the work, but also that they hadn't lost their femininity in the process. Look closely at many of the most famous photos. The women's overalls are often spotless. They are smiling broadly, even while performing a difficult task. The image is idealized. Some of the nation's greatest photographers were enlisted for this work. Dorothea Lange, famous for her stark images of the Great Depression, took photos of women working in the Kaiser shipyards in California. Her photos have a greater sense of realism, but even she was working under the constraints of a government assignment. The famous "We Can Do It" poster was based on a photograph, but the artist, J. Howard Miller, took great liberties, creating a much more muscular and stylized image of the woman. But here is the crucial point: even if the photos were staged, the work was real. The woman in the photo might have been asked to pose and smile for the camera, but 5 minutes before and 5 minutes after, she was operating that same drill press. The team of riveters might have been arranged for a perfect composition, but they were a real team, and that was a real bomber wing they were working on. The propaganda may have been a fantasy, but it was a fantasy built on a foundation of incredible, undeniable fact. Millions of women really were building planes and ships. They really were operating heavy machinery. They really were a vital part of the war effort. The photos then occupy a strange space between reality and myth. They are historical documents, but they are also advertisements. They show us what was happening, but they show it to us through a very specific, carefully controlled lens. They capture a truth, but not the whole truth. The whole truth would have included the grease, the noise, the exhaustion, the discrimination, and the danger. But the propaganda photos edited all of that out. They gave the country a hero it could rally behind, a clean, smiling, and capable Rosie the Riveter. And in doing so, they created an image so powerful that it has come to define an entire generation of women. How many photos were taken that were deemed unsuitable for propaganda purposes, photos showing exhaustion, injury, or racial tension, and were subsequently buried in an archive? Did the women in the photos get paid for their modeling, or was it just considered part of their job? And how has our modern understanding of this era been shaped and perhaps limited by the fact that the visual record we have was so heavily curated and controlled? Number one, what have we forgotten? We remember the iconic images. We remember the name Rosie the Riveter. We remember the story of how women stepped up and helped win the war. But the popular memory is a simplified one. It's like a well-known song where we all know the chorus, but we've forgotten the verses. And the verses contain the most interesting and important parts of the story. We have forgotten the sheer diversity of the women who worked. We picture a young white woman in a bandana, but we forget the African-American women who fought a war on two fronts. We forget the older women, the grandmothers who went to work. We forget the Hispanic and Asian women whose stories are rarely told. The workforce was a complex tapestry, not a monolithic poster. We have forgotten the sheer difficulty and danger of the work. The smiling photos have hidden the reality of the noise, the grime, the long hours, and the constant risk of injury or death. We have romanticized the experience, turning a grueling, often terrifying job into a symbol of glamorous empowerment. We forget the women who were injured, who suffered long-term health problems, or who were killed on the job. Their sacrifice was just as real as a soldier's. We have forgotten the resistance they faced. We like to think of a nation united, but the reality was that these women faced skepticism from employers, hostility from male co-workers, and a constant struggle to balance their jobs with their responsibilities at home. They weren't just handed these jobs, they had to prove themselves every single day. We have forgotten what happened afterward. The story doesn't end with victory in 1945. For the women, that was the beginning of a new struggle. We have largely forgotten the betrayal they felt when they were unceremoniously fired from the jobs they had performed so well. We forget the social and economic pressure that pushed them back into the home. We tell the first half of the story, the inspiring rise, but we often leave out the second half, the disappointing fall. And perhaps, most of all, we have forgotten their individual voices. Rosie the Riveter is a useful symbol, but it's also a blanket that covers up 6 million individual stories. 6 million women, each with her own name, her own hopes, her own fears, and her own unique experience. They weren't all the same. Some loved the work and the freedom it brought. Some hated it but did it out of duty or necessity. Some were changed by it forever. Others just wanted their old lives back. The photos show us their faces, but they don't tell us their stories. And so many of those stories are now lost to time. What were the names of the women in the most famous anonymous photographs? How many Rosies lived the rest of their lives in poverty, their wartime contributions forgotten and unrewarded? And what other stories from this era, what other revolutions in our society have we allowed to be flattened into a single, simple, and ultimately misleading image?